right, welcome to another TMG interview. Today I'm talking to another documentarian. It's been 3 years since I've talked to documentary filmmakers and one of my TMG interview series. And since it's been so long, we needed to celebrate bringing in two documentary filmmakers, and they are the makers of the National Geographic release Sugarcane. Thank you for being here, Julian Brave Noisecat and Emily Kassie.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for
for
having us.
having us. Yeah, good to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to talk to you both. I found the documentary fascinating and frustrating and exceptionally well made. But just for those who are tuning in, please give us a brief recap of what Sugarcane is all about. Then we'll get to breaking it down a little bit.
Sure. So Sugarcane follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian residential school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia, Canada.
It begins with the text. The Canadian government forced indigenous children to attend segregated boarding schools. And I was shocked at the behavior, no, not joking, of Canada. The friendly neighbors to the north that we've had for years. And then I saw that most were run by the Catholic Church. Well, then it all made sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because there were 139 of these schools in Canada, but that Canadian system was based off the American one, which was 3 times as big. And that system, as one of its architects put it, was built to kill the Indian, save the man. And of course, the Canadian system echoed that in their one of its architects saying, this is a way to solve the quote unquote Indian problem.
Yeah, and has that ever been just straight up referred to as genocide?
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada officially describes the Indian residential schools as an act of cultural genocide. But I think what our documentary and similar investigations to the one that our documentary follows across Canada suggest is that perhaps that modifier of quote unquote cultural genocide is unnecessary. Maybe we should simply just refer to these things as a genocide. At the same time, though, I would say that, that's such a loaded word. And, I think that you can get stuck in a debate about the semantics of this history without really grappling with what truly happened and the consequences of it for people today, which I think is truly a human experience that is much deeper than, what sort of label we put on it.
And this is a foundational story of North America. This is the story of how the land was taken, of how to, disempower indigenous communities in both countries and forcibly separate children from their parents, break down this family system, take away the language, take away the culture, and just systematic abuse that allowed the nation states to take the land and have kind of total control over indigenous populations.
Yeah, and let's not mince words. I mean, I got so angry watching the movie that I don't want to mince words. It meant murder, right? I mean, there are children being impregnated by the members of the church, and then the babies need to be sort of hidden away, and they do that by burning them, incinerating them. So how is your movie? But then what your movie does beautifully is not be angry. It actually takes the time to show the joy of the culture and the families who have lived through this, and colorful ceremonies and that kind of thing. So how important was it for you to find that balance?
Obviously, the Indian residential schools were an incredibly destructive and painful experience for families like my own. And they were so painful, in fact, that to this day, many of us still don't really talk about them. And the survivors of those schools, have suppressed many of those memories and don't tell their kids or their grandkids. And that's part of the burden of living with this genocide. On the other hand, I think that there's a lot of beauty in the way that Native communities like mine are living today. I think that we have a deep connection to the places that we come from, which happen to be some of the most beautiful landscapes in the entire world. We have a deep understanding of who we are. We maintain an attachment to our culture, our traditions, and our language, despite policy efforts to eliminate those things. and we remained together. You know, I think that today, with so much of the world so alienated from, you know, community, from family, where, you know, lots of people have cousins and that doesn't mean something to them. You know, in our world, we are related to each other, and that really means something to us. And we really spend time together, and we really take care of one another. And I think that that is core to what it means to be a human being. And I think that it's something that not just Native people, but all people need to get back to.
This isn't just a story about destruction and horrors. It's a story about survival in the face of all of that. And what is so epic and beautiful about this world, and the way that we wanted to treat it in the cinematic language, is that, you know, despite the fact that, as you know, Julian so beautifully puts it, this is a post-apocalyptic world for Indigenous people. Communities are holding on to each other and building, not to quote Joe Biden's first campaign, but building it back. I didn't realize I would be doing a Joe Biden slogan there, build back better. But you know, people are thriving, and there were so many. Making this film, although there were harrowing and tough moments, was just such an incredible journey for us. We had incredible time spending time with people on the land, fishing and hunting, and people are so funny and filled with life and love. And, you know, you can see Willie being an incredible dad to his kids and breaking cycles of trauma and violence imposed by this colonial system. And we thought that that was just as, you know, important to emphasize. And, you know, I think to your first point about the pattern, evidence pointing to a pattern of infanticide at St. Joseph's Mission, these are stories that have been told across North America, and we feel like this film is just cracking open the beginning of finding the truth. And the Canadian government and the Catholic Church are very quick to want to get to the reconciliation piece of this. But we feel that at the very least, communities are owed the truth, and we haven't gotten there yet.
Let me go back to the beginning. So you talked about how personally this affects your family, Julian. So was it that launched you into this project to begin with? Because there are also some investigators, Charlene and Whitney, who are looking into all of this as well and discovering what's behind the unmarked graves that get discovered in the beginning of the film. So which of those things kickstarted this, and how did those two things, your family and the investigators, come together?
Yeah, actually, honestly, my family's connection to in-residential schools was one of the reasons I almost did not work on this documentary. It's kind of the opposite. So M actually instigated the events that led to, well, not the events, but instigated the project. And, you know, at the same time, you know, there, after this discovery in Kamloops, there of 215 potential unmarked graves, there were investigations that began all across Canada, and then also as well in the United States. And we follow one of those investigations in the documentary. But I'll let Em talk a little bit more about why she was drawn to the subject.
So I'm an investigative journalist and doc filmmaker. I've told visual stories all over the world about human rights abuses and conflicts, but I had never turned my lens on my own country. I'm Canadian. And the last year of residential schools was my first year of kindergarten, and yet I knew relatively little to none about it. So when that news broke in May of 2021, I felt totally drawn and gut pulled to the story. And the first thing I did was text Julian. Jules and I worked our first reporting jobs together almost a decade ago, and we were randomly sat at the desks next to each other. And I just thought Julian was brilliant, and he was a friend, and I'd watched him, you know, carry on a career as an incredible writer, historian of Indigenous life in North America, and thinker, and many multi-hyphenates. And so when this came up, I just thought he would be the right person to work with on this. And he told me he would think about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search, as these searches had started kicking off across the country. And I found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers in the Williams Lake First Nation. And I wrote Chief a cold email that day, and he called me back that afternoon and said, The creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search. So I met with council on Zoom. I booked flights to Williams Lake. I got my gear packed up to go. And about 2 weeks later, I heard back from Julian.
And when I called Em back and told her that I'd be open to collaborating with her on a documentary about the subject, I obviously needed to take a little bit of time, as I was suggesting with my initial answer, because this subject is so heavy and painful for my family. So I took a little time to do that, and I finally decided that it would be okay for me to work on a documentary on the subject. And when I called them back, that's when she told me that she'd identified a First Nation that was leading search, and that search was happening at St. Joseph's Mission. And I just about fell out of my chair, as you
Wow.
might imagine. And then I said, wow, that's crazy. Did you know that's the school that my family was sent to and where my father was born? So out of 139 Indian residential schools in Canada, M, without knowing it, chose the school that my family was taken away to and where my father's life began, which is, I mean, to this day, I just don't even know how that happens.
I mean, it feels like the creator was at work there well before, like a long time ago, to have you meet, to have you gain your skills, to have you come together, and then the timing be perfect for wanting this documented. That's all crazy how well that all aligned.
Yeah, I think obviously the Indian residential schools were about many things, but one of them, they were a spiritual form of colonization, right? The purpose of the Indian residential school was in part to eliminate the belief system of First Nations people and to replace it with Catholicism in this instance. And so obviously in this project, we have to take questions of faith and belief and spirituality seriously. And I think we also need to take seriously the narrative traditions of the people, my people, whose story this is. And in our narrative traditions, in our accounting for the world and its events, the ancestors, those who've come before, have agency. They sometimes intervene in the present. And, I think that just the way that things came together in this documentary, and then the way that things unfolded around us and in front of us and before the camera, we really did have to take that spiritual element of this story seriously, which I think is the right way to tell a story like this.
And I think smart to not lead it with you forward, like a Michael Moore or Morgan Spurlock type, with your running the film with your agenda. You very quietly, unassumingly let things unfold that we get to witness, and I think that's pretty great. And it looks fantastic. So, Emily, you're a cinematographer on this, right? So, but give me some shout out to the creative team here, DP and editors. Who are they, and how did it all, how did you guys all work together?
Yeah, so Chris LaMarca and I shot the film together, and it was another kind of incredible creative partnership. We shot two camera a lot, and sometimes I shot alone, and I learned in those alone moments so much that he had taught me, and I had carried over from his kind of beautiful and patient cinematography. We made really collective choices about uh, telling, as I spoke to before, this kind of very epic but also intimate story, and trying to integrate a lot of Julian's ideas and perspectives in the way we were shooting. So Julian, would say something, and as I mentioned earlier, this idea of a post-apocalyptic world for indigenous people. Well, how do you capture that? There's the burn of the trees that we move through in this drone shot where you see these burnt trees, you see the deer in shadow in front of the milling apparatus. Like there are these kind of interstitial moments that speak to the world that was left behind, and that people now have to find their way through. And then we had an incredible editing team in Nathan Panwar and Maya Daisy Hawk. And, we had this kind of incredible 5.5 hour edit that we loved. This cut that had about twice as many storylines. And Jules and I went to them and said, we'd like this to be a kind of Western, a reverse Western. We want faith to be in conversation with spirituality. We want the spirit world to have a life. We want multi-character narratives, and here are all the many, many beats of those narratives. And we have this investigation, and through, ingenuity and a ton of trial and error and failure and discovery, we had this incredible collective experience of finding the film through iteration and, throwing things at the wall and them not working and trying again.
Well, for those who want to watch it, 107 minutes. That's where you ended up, just so people know that I
For
get
sure, it's not
into.
5.5 hours. Maybe also Jules could maybe speak to Molly, because he really found Molly's music, and it's such a core part of the film.
Yeah, in a project like this that is inherently so collaborative, I think that neither of us could have done this alone, and we couldn't have done it with our team. And part of what was so enriching about this experience was the opportunity to have that creative high, with a bunch of other brilliant people, and to discover so much about this film and what it could be together. One of the things, though, that you get to do when you're, I guess, in the director's chair, is that once in a long while you like kind of can just say something, you want something to be a certain way, and people maybe have to deal with that. And so I kind of played that card maybe once in the making of this documentary, when I found this musician named Molly Obamsawin, she's about a couple years younger than us. So I don't know, you could call her young, I guess. Incredibly talented, jazz, folk, multi-musicianist, vocalist, who had this really well received and reviewed album called Sweet Tooth that I read about in The Guardian. Then I listened to it, and as soon as I heard it, I texted Em and Kellen, our producer, and I was like, we need to work with Molly. And I put it in such a way that I was kind of clear that like we kind of had to work with Molly. And she's obviously indigenous as well. She's from the First Nation of Odanak, and also happens to be, just to mention for your audience, the niece of one of the most significant indigenous filmmakers of all time, and one of the most significant Canadian filmmakers of all time, Alanis Obamsawin, whose filmography is honestly insane. And if you happen to go to TIFF, for example, there's a book in their gift shop about Alanis Obamsawin. So she comes from this very storied artistic Native family from Eastern Canada.
Cool. Hey, look, every once in a while you got to play the buck stops here card, right? Like, hey, we're
Yeah,
using Molly, and that's
so
what's up.
right, both Kellen and I were like, wow, this jazz album is amazing. Can she score a film?
Sure.
And the answer was yes, she can, and at the highest possible level. And she was able to bring together, the themes of the Western and the faith element and the kind of traditional songs and honor songs. It's unbelievable, the score. So we highly recommend her
Well,
work.
I mean, yeah, that's part of the entire creative team that delivers this story gracefully, in a fluid manner that doesn't, it's not abrasive, but the point certainly gets across. And I love your statement there, Em. Uh, Epic but intimate. That's certainly how this comes across. So I know I only have time for like one or two more questions. So, how is your relationship now with your father, Julian, after all of this has come to light in a now public forum?
Yeah, so I actually moved in with my dad for 2 years while we made the documentary. So this was the first time that we lived together since I was a small child. I had been living on the East Coast for career reasons for a decade, until this documentary, as well as a book that I'm currently editing and writing, brought me back to the West Coast and allowed me to do my sort of creative pursuits full time. And both of those projects are very much about my dad and my relationship to my dad. And of course, this film is so much about the circumstances around his birth and the intergenerational story around that. And so I moved in with him. We lived across the hallway from each other. We cooked each other breakfast. We hung out many nights around the wood fire furnace. And, I learned so much more about his life, and I think he learned a lot more about mine as well. And we just honestly had a great time. And as you see in the documentary, he's an artist. And so the first thing I did when I got back from New York is he picked me up from where we were editing the film, I should say. He picked me up from the airport. We went straight home and watched the documentary, which didn't even have like sound and color done yet. And he was on the edge of his seat. He was laughing his ass off. He was crying. He was, he was enthralled in this thing. And he really felt like it did his story justice. It did our story justice. And I think on another level, being the son of an artist, he felt that, I was carrying forward the artistic legacy of him and his name in my own way. And I think that was really special for him as well. So we're doing great. And we're here in Santa Fe to show the film, and we just went and got breakfast just this morning.
That is an outstanding. Oh, go ahead.
Ed would make like a little appearance and just jump out of that door because
he's actually we have adjoining
oh my God,
rooms, so
bring
we
him
can go
in.
back and forth.
Ed is the best. He's also our biggest fan on social media. So I'm running our social media channel, and without fail, he is the only person who likes, comments, and shares every single post. He's a very proud dad. And yeah, we love him.
That's outstanding. What a great side effect. Well, we'll have to leave it there, but everyone go see Sugarcane. And is there like a social media that someone should be following to
Yeah,
see
Em
what's going
does
on?
an excellent job with our @Sugarcane Film account. It's really curated really well. It's got information about screenings, theatrical screenings. We're about to kick off a res tour, we should say, to 10 Native communities in the US and Canada that we're super excited about. And you can follow along there for updates.
And you can also go to our website, sugarcanefilm.com, which will also take you to every available screening and more information on our impact campaign.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.